Okay, great. All right, so this session, as you know, is all about creating gender-inclusive genetics instruction. And I've divided our topic for today into 3 sections. The first is to remember our why and think about why we're doing what we're doing. You have all just done a great job of expanding on that, and so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. Our second section is about creating a framework for inclusive instruction so that rather than thinking about individual pieces of trivia or sort of disjointed factual understanding, we can create a cohesive framework for our teaching. And the third session I'm calling breadcrumbs and resources. And this is a section where I want to help you make some connections to specific content and specific areas that might help to add greater depth and diversity to your teaching in this area. The reality is we will not have time to go into all of those areas in depth today. And so this section is one where we're going to hope that we can make sure you get those slides after the fact, and then you'll get that information to explore in a little more detail. Okay, so first things first, we always need to remember our why whenever we're exploring something in our teaching, trying to deepen our practice. And when it comes to our instruction in genetics, you've all shown how you are excited, you're enthusiastic, you're open about making sure we're supporting all of our students. And that's so important because the reality is our transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex students without extra support and understanding are more likely to have some adverse outcomes. I don't like to dwell on this section just because I want to also uplift the realities of gender euphoria and the joy that our transgender and gender nonconforming students can feel when their identities are affirmed. But we have to remember that this affirmation is also life-saving, and so therefore it is our obligation to make sure we are caring for our students in this way. Very happily, this is also a matter of MCPS policy, keeping in mind that this is in line with our policies around affirming student identity. There was a great update that was pushed out from our central office content team. That update was actually pushed out after the session was proposed. So I was really excited when that came out because I said, oh, great, this allows us to actually go a little bit further in our session, which was wonderful. So I know that this is an area where we're all moving, we're all working, trying to push our practice forward collectively. All right, hey, good to see you. Glad you made it. And then, of course, also keeping in mind that because this is a part of our policy and enacting our teaching within MCPS, we also know that that means it's not optional. It's something that we really need to do. And last, this is one I think is often overlooked, but the traditional approach to teaching genetics, sex, and gender is very outdated, and it's also medically inaccurate. I think oftentimes people perceive that there is a tension between affirming student identity and teaching quote unquote the science. And the reality is there is no conflict. Humans are biological organisms. The things that we do are biological in nature. And so when we are thinking about how to make our instruction more inclusive, it's not a conflict between science and facts and feelings, as certain people like to frame this so-called debate. There is no debate, there is no conflict. The reality is we are teaching a more accurate portrayal of genetics when we include this nuance and we include this detail. It is the outdated oversimplification where the factual errors lie. So just a little bit to remind us of our why as we delve into this work. This next section of the presentation is a framework for our pedagogy. This section is very heavily inspired by the project Gender Inclusive Biology. They are the ones who have developed this framework. They have some wonderful publications around it, as well as a very accessible website on it. I would very much encourage you to keep in touch with them or to look at that resource and get connected to them if you are not already. But I wanted us to explore this framework in a little more depth today, so we could kind of try it on for size and see what it might feel like for us to have this as part of our teaching. So the 5 pieces of this framework are authenticity, continuity, affirmation, anti-oppression, and student agency. And we're just going to kind of go point by point through those. First up, authenticity, thinking about bringing your authentic self, honoring the authentic selves of your students, and authentic representations of biology in our teaching. So of course, always wanting to ground our teaching in scientific research, questioning our assumptions, both our assumptions and the assumptions of our students, and engaging in reflection before, during, and after our teaching to help us understand where we are really at on certain things, both in terms of our comfort, our sense of our efficacy, our knowledge. Part of being authentic with students is having that self-awareness And so there are some reflection questions here that you might consider, such as how prepared do you feel to discuss these topics, and how comfortable are you with discussing these topics? Those two are not necessarily the same answer. Bearing in mind, it is always okay not to know everything, nobody does, but also that just as with any other unit where you might identify a gap in content knowledge, it's important that we do the research to address those gaps before we start teaching, which by coming here today, you're already starting to do. And I'm hoping to connect you to some resources that will help you to continue doing that. The second piece is continuity, and this is one of the most important parts of the framework, in my opinion, because often when people want to become more inclusive in their genetics instruction, they imagine it as a lesson plan. So they kind of say, what is the lesson that I can teach about sex and gender and chromosomes that will help me to be more inclusive? What's the right lesson plan for that topic? But the reality is this is a lens for all of our teaching, not just one lesson plan that we're teaching within a unit. So we need to focus on inclusivity throughout the unit, rather than having, a gender day or a special lesson, which we really want to avoid, as those can be stigmatizing. We want this to be part of our overall approach in the unit. Keeping in mind also that this focus on equity is a necessary condition for our students to learn throughout the unit. It's not just a checkbox or a one-day learning objective for us to cover. This is a unit that is likely to provoke anxiety for our transgender and gender nonconforming students. And with that in mind, we want to be broadcasting from the very beginning that we see them, we consider them, that we are not a threat to them. With that in mind as well, it's very difficult to undo the distancing that can come with some common classroom practices. So for example, if throughout your unit on genetics, you are addressing your class as boys and girls or ladies and gentlemen, that is a binary that you are presenting. If you then try to have one day where you suddenly pivot and acknowledge the existence of non-binary people, that's going to be more difficult for your students to really understand as authentic or feel welcomed by, because of how your speech leading up to that lesson has alienated them. So when I say throughout the lesson, it includes things like that language that we're using with our students throughout the unit. It doesn't necessarily mean that your whole unit is about sex and gender. We also want to start from a position of diversity and inclusion rather than teaching a narrow norm and then trying to add on to an oversimplification. So rather than saying everything works like this, there is, for example, there is male and then there's female and, oh, but also, we can start from an understanding that diversity is inherent to discussions of genetics. Without the diversity, a lot of the important conversations around natural selection, of course, are not happening. So knowing that diversity is going to be inherent in the conversation, we can embrace it. And oftentimes the traditional approach is to teach an oversimplified rule and then try to explain all of the exceptions to that rule. We can instead start expansive and use diverse examples from multiple species. I've got some of those examples in the third section of the presentation. So continuity is very important so that we are really maintaining this focus throughout the unit. The third area is affirmation. So not just acknowledging the existence of diversity, but celebrating it and viewing it as an asset. We also want to make sure that we are anticipating areas of potential challenge. One of the things that is extremely affirming for our students is when we already see them coming and we address a potential roadblock for them before they even know it's there. When we come to it, they see it and they realize that we cared about them and that we saw them enough to take care of it. And it creates a huge amount of trust and relief for those students. It builds a lot more trust than any amount of hanging up safe space or rainbow flags could ever do. So this is also an extension of some of our existing practices. For example, understanding the needs of our adopted students and our students who have single parent family structures. We understand that an assignment like create a family pedigree does not meet the needs of those students and can be threatening or alienating to them. When I talk about anticipating potential areas of challenge for our transgender and gender nonconforming students, I'm thinking about many of the same things. The pedigree assignment is certainly one of them. But anytime that there are requirements around self-identifying or labeling things as exclusively male or female, that is an area of potential consideration. And we can talk about some more in the third section as well. But just in general, trying to think as you plan each activity, how might this impact my transgender students? Even just something as simple as saying, boys on this side, girls on that side is an enormous threat for a lot of our trans students. With this in mind, we can also red pen our resources to make sure that we are showing affirming resources and not showing resources that are othering or threatening. And when I say this, I'm talking about things like videos, handouts, activities, reading passages that you might have, all of the above. If you use the CK12 textbook, remember that that text is fully editable, for example, within Canvas. You can change that language to be something more inclusive if you disagree with the language that's being used in that textbook. But in general, we want to be thinking about what modifications might I need for this resource to be consistent with my values of inclusion and with some of the language resources that we know are best practice. If you are in need of a glossary, by the way, the links in the beginning of this presentation include one to the MCPS policy around gender inclusion and affirmation. There is an excellent glossary of terms in there that you can look at. So keeping in mind that we can control what we show within our space and that our classrooms do not have to be a place where we, reinforce perceptions of binary gender, for example. It is true that our students are also going to be consumers of resources in the outside world where there might be more simplistic language used, especially around topics, for example, like puberty education. But we can help to teach our students to be more critical consumers of those resources, especially by using different language in the resources that we either modify or create ourselves. Within the category of affirmation, we can also provide representation of diverse reproductive strategies. This just helps to highlight that diversity is not some sort of like exclusive to humans thing. We'll talk more about this in part 3 as well, but this can just help to really affirm that diversity is natural and expected, that neither diversity in general nor the identities of our transgender and gender nonconforming students are unexpected in any way, that we see them and we expected them. Number 4 is Anti-Oppression Framework, recognizing that science can be used to support oppressive systems. This is an opportunity to situate trans exclusionary perspectives within a historical context. I have more details on this in part 3 as well. But in general, when we're thinking about our anti-oppression lens, we want to be thinking about what is the legacy of how science has been used, both specifically to exclude transgender and gender nonconforming people, but also more broadly to exclude and marginalize, realistically speaking, the majority of humans. If students are raising oppressive talking points or perspectives, it is also very helpful to model responding from a place of compassion first. And when I say compassion, I mean compassion for the student with that bigoted idea, but also openly expressing compassion for the students who would be oppressed by the kind of language that's being used. An example that comes to mind is, wow, I understand that you are curious, but I think that the way you ask that question could be really hurtful for people. Let's think about, and then redirect to data. One example of this that I've seen used very effectively is students raising oppressive talking points around Leah Thomas, the transgender swimmer, and that being responded to with, let's look at her data and how her performance has compared with cisgender women. And using that data exploration as a way to model scientific thinking while also demonstrating that she does not have an unfair advantage solely because she is transgender. And again, there's a little bit more on this in the breadcrumb section as well. And our last piece here is student agency. It helps students a lot to have a sense of control and to have voice within especially this unit. But also it is helpful for us in general to have a sense of where our class is at as a whole and how we might be able to meet them there. This is a unit where it can be very helpful to give a pre-assessment before starting your unit to get student perspectives. So you might consider in your pre-assessment including a few questions about sex and gender, just to sort of understand the perspectives of your students. We, above all else, have a responsibility to do no harm. And so if your pre-assessment shows that, oh, wow, these two students sit next to each other and student A is transgender and student B just said that being transgender is impossible or something, that might be a signal that you need to rearrange your table groups, right? Because we have a responsibility not to put that transgender student in a position where they might be subjected to harm by that student, even if that harm is something that student says under their breath or them rolling their eyes or microaggressions. We still have an obligation to do what we can to prevent that harm. It's also helpful to get feedback from students. Do these things make sense for you? Do you feel like a sense of connection to the content that we're doing? Did I mess anything up? Do you think there's things that I left out? These can be great questions to ask our students. It's important that we're asking for that feedback from all of our students and not just our transgender or our gender nonconforming students, so that we can avoid singling them out or asking them to do something that other students are not shouldering the burden of. And it's also helpful in this section to use sentence frames for them that can encourage them to consider how ideas have changed and to normalize the idea that even if we come in with one idea, it is normal to look at evidence and change our thinking. So things like, I used to think, but now I think, frameworks can just be very useful in helping the students to progress in their thinking. And last up, just giving some choice when possible for students, keeping in mind that some of these topics might feel very intense or sensitive to them, and that students might want to explore something that feels a little less heated. On the other hand, there might be students who want to learn more about themselves, learn more about people who are like them, and having an opportunity to do that exploration with a teacher's support could feel extremely empowering for them. So we don't want to shy away from explorations of, for example, intersex conditions, but we also want to give students some choice and agency around that. So those would be the 5 sections of our framework. Before we move forward, I wanted to give us a quick chance to check in. You can check either in the Pear Deck if you are still connected, or just in the Zoom chat, either one works. One thing that felt familiar from this framework that felt connected to your previous teaching, and then one thing that you want to learn more about. All right, thank you so much for these reflections. These are really, really helpful to see. And thank you also for some of you who have given me some feedback. I really appreciate that. All right, so I'm seeing a lot of interest in the anti-oppression aspects of the framework and learning more about that. I think that might be a great place for us to look as our final slide today, since we are about to wrap up. But of course, we will make sure that we share all of these slides so that you're able to see all of the information that's there. So thank you for that. I am going to click forward now. So if you did not have the chance to submit yours, don't worry. I just wanted to get a sense of where we were at after seeing the framework. So the most interest seemed to be in the anti-oppression section. So we're going to jump ahead to a little bit more of the details there. So when thinking about an anti-oppression lens, this is specifically anti-oppression with regards to sex and gender. Of course, anti-oppression within biology teaching is a much bigger topic. One way in which we can support the anti-oppression piece of the framework is to recognize that science is often distorted to support oppressive systems. Oftentimes people have said things that are, I will see comments that are things like, wow, some of the exclusionary language I see really reminds me of the 20th century eugenics movement. It seems like a similarity, and it's not just a similarity, it's a continuation. Something that is often not known is that there is an extremely iconic, well-known photograph of a Nazi book burning, where people oftentimes use this as sort of a symbol of Nazi oppression and attempting to stifle dissent. But what a lot of people don't know is that the books being burned in that photograph are research from the Berlin Institute for Sexology, and they are research about people who would today probably be called transgender or gender nonconforming. So when we think about the legacy of oppression in this area, what we see in politics today is not new. It is just an extension of existing oppressions that ebb and flow in how loud they are. There are other connections or parallels you might consider making within how so-called science or pseudoscience has been misused throughout history to oppress groups of people. One example would be phrenology. But as we consider which examples from the history of science to use, we just need to be careful that we are not creating an environment that does additional harm or threat to our most marginalized students. So of course, those connections need to be made in an intentional and thoughtful way to ensure that we are not harming marginalized students. The second bullet point on here is a little bit more detail about speaking back to bullet points, for example, about Leah Thomas or other transgender athletes. The transgender athlete question is one that comes up a lot. I'll just give you a preview that the last section of this, I have some talking points just for speaking back to very common bad faith arguments. This one is a common one related to swimmers like Leah Thomas, or athletes like Leah Thomas, I should say. And I've got a couple of links that'll be there for you. I see that we are at 10:28. I want to respect your time, and we are going to be starting another set of presentations at 10:30. But thank you so much for being here today. Please let me know if you have any other questions. And I really appreciate your time getting up and joining the session this morning. It makes a huge difference for your students. So thank you for being here.